The Jeremy Kyle Show.
I guess this show's called The Jeremy Kyle Show, right? But it could be called The Show.
Will you believe it or not?
Oi! Until your ass, shut up! Oh, no!
The most evil television show in English history. A viciously exploitative production that took the most vulnerable people from society and put a spotlight on their life, with a host who would mercilessly ridicule them for a live audience reaction of abuse and laughter. The Jeremy Kyle Show ran for over 14 years, with more than 3,000 episodes. That is, until the dark truth finally came to light. Born in 1965, Jeremy grew up privileged. His father worked as an accountant to the Queen Mother for over 40 years, and as a result, Jeremy attended a private boys' school for his entire education. He then attended university to study history and sociology. Following this, he bounced around employment for about a decade before deciding on his future. This included selling life insurance, as a recruitment consultant, and finally in radio advertising. In 1996, he transitioned onto the microphone himself as a broadcaster, and over the next decade, honed his craft. Within a couple years, Jeremy Kyle had developed a recurring show that was seeing great success. It was called Jez's Confessions. The premise was real simple. Jeremy would wait for callers to provide content for the audience. These callers could talk about absolutely anything that they wanted. Jeremy was there to listen, give advice, and hope that it was interesting enough to keep his listeners entertained. Which it almost always was, as people would usually talk about the things they wouldn't discuss in public. Problems involving addiction, infidelity, violence, sex, mental health, or anything else you can think of that would traditionally be taboo. This format, even as early as the year 2000, was polarizing. You either love it or you hate it, said Jeremy's boss. The amazing thing is that the people who hate it are as loyal to it as the people who love it, Jeremy added. And this remained true the entire time Jez's Confessions ran, which was for a little over 5 years across multiple different radio stations. In fact, the only reason it even ended was that it was simply too successful to remain on radio. The format was almost perfect for capturing a recurring audience. There was, however, a few ways to improve the formula. It needed visuals, and so television, an audience, and the guests there in person to air out their story live, it was now perfect. This also came with a rebrand from Jez's Confessions to The Jeremy Kyle Show. It was an immediate smash success, and you can see why.
It's your first day. Do me a favour, big boy. Get rid of that. You, be quiet.
The Jeremy Kyle Show was essentially a magnifying glass above an ant colony. That is, of course, if the ant colony was only the lowest rungs of the social ladder, the working class. People from council estates, the roughest low-income areas in the country, people with little to no education, no money, often no job, and no prospects of getting a job. The guests were often drug addicts, gambling addicts, convicts, thieves, and almost always with severely debilitating mental and/or physical illness that went without treatment for so long that it had completely ruined their lives. What good, upstanding members of the public would call the worst of the absolute worst while looking down their nose. The people on the other side, looking through the magnifying glass, were mostly split between two groups. Those who deemed themselves classes above and found pleasure in seeing the fascinating life of people they could never understand and would never interact with in person, and the second group which were from a similar background as the guests. Perhaps they saw themselves, or people they knew from day-to-day life, in those people on stage, someone they could relate to, or prop themselves up with the idea that while they might be in a bad situation, at least they're not those people on the Jeremy Kyle Show. There was of course a third group too, those who watched to see what was going on, but quickly realised just how sick and twisted it all was, and moved along.
What is it? Why does everybody talk? What is that? Shut up! What, it's you, love? fucking unbelievable.
Regarding the format of the show, it was one that already saw success overseas with the likes of Jerry Springer, but due to differences in law without any of the fake interactions, which would not be allowed in England. This is the crux of what made the show as popular as it was. It was completely real, it was raw, and it was insane.
Mouth, keep going! You dirty dog!
Each episode, Jeremy would introduce the scenario, give a little bit of context, and then bring on the guest who would explain further while being questioned by the host. They would have the people involved in the conflict backstage, watching and listening in. They would often cut to the reactions of those people getting more and more upset, more angry as things went on, and Jeremy would then likely bring those people on stage and just wait for the fireworks, which would always happen. The claim of Jeremy Kyle and the producers was that this was mediating issues. What Jeremy Kyle was actually doing was shouting at, belittling, abusing, and bullying these people. And the audience could not get enough of this, but who can blame them with the topics of each show? Some of the classics include, your boyfriend killed my hamster. Has my son cut up my sex toy? I'll marry you if you prove you only cheated 16 times. Have I been having sex with my brother? And who can forget, I'll leave my boyfriend if he doesn't stop eating cereal. Eventually, most episodes involved a lie detector test, which was usually the point that the audience went absolutely wild. The victims started screaming, fighting, trying to run away, but being cornered by Jeremy, cameras, and security. The format was pure gold, the ratings were through the roof, and as Jeremy had accurately pointed out years prior with a less polished product, whether you loved or hated it, you still watched. It was just that hard to look away. Even if you knew what it was, a gross exploitation, it was interesting to see the most intimate details and interaction of those who live a life so foreign to you they might as well be another species entirely. For this reason, it was the most popular program on the network by a country mile, but despite being so visibly vile, somehow things behind the scenes were even worse. As early as the first ever episode of the Jeremy Kyle Show, people saw what it was. Even if all the proper precautions were taken, there was only one way the show would end, in tragedy. Now, when we think about what is important to a television network, to the creators and to the producers, we encounter the vicious cycle. When your show is about conflict, about insane scenarios that bewilder onlookers, causing them to stop what they're doing and watch like that of a car crash, you stand to benefit the more extreme this conflict becomes. That means the impetus is to find the most extreme guests possible. It also means you are heavily incentivized to make sure these extreme guests are fired up the minute they hit the stage. In an investigative documentary released by Channel 4, another UK broadcaster, former staff were interviewed anonymously. These former staff revealed allegations of the most insidious off-camera behaviour you could ever imagine. Some of these allegations were backed up by former guests to the show, such as, upon arriving to the Jeremy Kyle Show studio, each individual in the conflict were taken to separate rooms and manipulated for multiple hours. Psychologically prodded and baited with information they knew would just get their blood boiling. He said this about you. Oh, you wouldn't believe what she just told me. I know what I'd do if I were in your position. You know, that sort of thing. Years on the job, watching people unravel in real time, taught the staff all the buttons they needed to press to get people in the mindset to immediately go for it when they got on stage. After all, the viewers were there for exactly that, for people to appear on stage and start going absolutely crazy immediately. They also alleged the producers would lie to guests right as they are about to walk on stage regarding the rewards of the show. For example, if you were there to get someone into rehab for a drug addiction, they would tell you that there was only one spot for rehab available and multiple families fighting for it. The family that made the best content for Jeremy's show would be given the spot. This wasn't true. There was a spot for all guests. Another allegation made by the anonymous workers was that they helped guests to bypass the mental health questionnaire, guiding them through answers that they knew might get them disqualified. After all, if they failed a mental health test, the show could not go on. And it was of course in the producers' best interest to get them through the liability portion to say that they were actually okay to proceed, even if that was not true. And again, the less okay they were, the more likely they were to make for good victims for the show. The checks and balances that were in place to protect the guests were alleged to be a facade, one that worked since the show continued for 14 years doing this. constantly fueling that vicious cycle of looking for the most vulnerable people you could find to be exploited for the machine of Schadenfreude. A question you will no doubt ask yourself while listening to this story is one of the most important questions in life. Why? Why would people sign up to the Jeremy Kyle Show after knowing what it was, when the evidence was in front of their eyes, how they would be treated on a national stage, how this would probably ruin their life? Well, the answer could have come up previously in the video during the exploitation portion, because they were manipulated and exploited, first by society and later by the producers of the show. Again, the people targeted were the most vulnerable among us, the ones who had nothing, the ones who were perhaps not mentally capable of making sound decisions, the ones that were the most desperate in life. The show did offer solutions to guests as a carrot on a stick. If you needed answers to a burning question and had no other way to know, you could turn to the Jeremy Kyle Show. Perhaps you were worried your partner was cheating on you, well, you could go and get a lie detector test for a few £100s, which you probably don't have, or you can go on the Jeremy Kyle Show and get it for free. Perhaps your daughter's a heroin addict and you can't afford rehab to get her clean. You know if you don't, you might lose her. Well, you can go on the Jeremy Kyle Show and they'll pay for rehab. Perhaps you think your child might biologically not be yours. You can't afford a paternity test, but Jeremy will get you on. The trick here, of course, is you are being offered these carrots, but to get the carrots, Jeremy would also be beating you with that stick. He will be degrading you, he will be bullying you, and the mob will be cheering.
About them, do you?
Don't you think I feel ashamed about
Oh yeah, what, during, before or afterwards?
After that.
Well then get off it!
That's what I come here for!
You didn't know, did you?
The other reason people went on the show was they thought it was a path to stardom, a path out of where they were living. They watched the Jeremy Kyle Show, they loved it, and they loved Jeremy himself. These people always thought they were the person who was right, and everyone else would be taking their side. The audience, Jeremy, people in the real world would watch their story and think, actually you're right, maybe this would make their life a little bit better. Almost always, they were actually wrong. They just didn't know how wrong they were until it was too late. One aspect to also consider, the Jeremy Kyle Show was about conflict between multiple parties, which means if someone had an issue with you, they could contact the producers and start the process, which resulted in the desperate producers relentlessly hounding you, allegedly lying to you, and trying everything they could to get you to say yes. And of course there's another why here. Why did the show work so well? People love Schadenfreude, I don't know why. We've all seen someone fall over and laughed. We've seen the popularity of things like America's Funniest Home Videos. It can't be denied that people inherently like to see things like that. Although for the majority of people, it's only funny when you know the person is okay after, when you don't see real harm. The insidious element of the Jeremy Kyle Show and others like it is that unlike seeing somebody fall over and knowing they're okay when they stand up after, you don't ever see the consequences. You watch these people as if they're characters in a play, they cry, they scream, they attack each other, but what happens after the cameras finally stop rolling? You don't ever know if they're okay. There's no moment where you have to come to terms with the damage that was caused for your entertainment. You thought you saw people reach their lowest, and you were wrong. If you ever met someone in real life who was on the show or dealt with problems as severe as those you were laughing at while watching, you would understand that when the cameras stopped rolling, that wasn't the end, it was just the beginning.
Steve Diamond came on the show to prove to his fiancée that he wasn't a cheat.
Diamond was found dead. Police believe he took his own life.
The reality of this is when you push anything to its limits, it will eventually break. For the Jeremy Kyle Show, the thing that would break was people.
Now, an episode of The Jeremy Kyle Show has been taken off the air at the last minute after a guest died shortly after appearing on the show.
Jeremy Kyle Show being taken off air has been named in newspapers as 63-year-old Steve Diamond.
In May of 2019, a man by the name of Steve Diamond contacted the Jeremy Kyle producers begging them to be allowed on the show. You see, Steve was in a relationship with a woman called Jane, or at least he had been before she found out he was lying to her. He told her that he was in the Navy for 10 years. He wasn't. He told her many things that turned out to be untrue. When confronted with this fact, he plainly stated, "I'm not sure why I do this. I just can't help myself." Steve was clearly a troubled man with some untreated mental health problems, but he did love Jane more than words could express. There was a divide in the relationship despite this. Jane couldn't shake the feeling that perhaps he was a cheat. Maybe part of the lies he'd told was that he was faithful to her. Steve begged her to believe him. He said he would take a lie detector test. He'd seen them do it on Jeremy Kyle, a show that Jane watched often. She really liked Jeremy. And so, that's what happened. Steve and Jane arrived on set, were separated into different rooms, and didn't see each other for about 6 hours. During that time, Steve took the test. He was then taken on stage with Jane, and exposed as a liar, told he was a cheat, to which he broke down, and wouldn't stop denying the results, wouldn't stop promising Jane it wasn't true. But according to Jeremy Kyle, there was no ifs, ands or buts. He was a cheater, he'd betrayed Jane, and that was that. They left the show. He called and called, left hundreds of voicemails, hundreds of texts, went to her window, but she didn't want to speak to him anymore. It was over. Steve then moved into a house nearby with all of his worldly possessions, 2 small bags. Despite being a man in his 60s, he had nothing in life. He'd lost the one thing he did have, Jane. I hope the Jeremy Kyle show is so happy now. They are responsible for what happens now. I hope this makes good ratings for them. I bet they keep this quiet. Never, never, never did I cheat on you. Never, never. My final words. And they were his final words. A few days later, Steve was gone. In the aftermath, the landlady he was staying with contacted the Jeremy Kyle show to tell them what had happened. They immediately went into damage control mode, moved Jane to a hotel for 3 days to control the narrative, and tried to keep her on side. They interviewed the landlady and her partner extensively, trying to get a read on what they were going to tell the press, who were now aware of the situation. ITV, the company who ran the Jeremy Kyle show for the last 14 years, suspended the airing of old and new episodes pending an investigation. This investigation lasted no longer than 2 days, at which point the show was permanently cancelled. Everyone was made jobless. The decision, however, was 14 years too late. After seeing the news break and the show cancelled, there was of course mixed reactions. Those who loved the show were distraught that they could no longer feel superior in the face of those born into abject poverty. Those who saw the show for what it was knew this was only a matter of time, and thankful it had taken so long for such tragedy to strike. Unfortunately, that wasn't true. People had lost their lives long before this. In fact, as early as 2005, the first year of the show, Jeremy Kyle convinced a man to leave his wife of 18 years. She was gone a week later. The husband claims neither of them were psychologically screened prior to the show, and if they had been, would have easily been rejected. His wife was on strong painkillers, suffered from depression, and had taken overdoses before. She was clearly unfit to be on a show like this. That wasn't the end of it. More and more deaths were then linked to the show over the 14-year runtime that saw over 20,000 people on its stage across more than 3,000 episodes. That's not taking into account the multiple women who were later battered by their partner, threatened with weapons, and the people who otherwise had their lives destroyed as a result of walking on that stage. And it was all done based on a technicality. You see, according to experts and during an investigative panel into the Jeremy Kyle show, a lie detector test is not infallible. In fact, without proper training, up-to-date equipment and perfect conditions, it can be a coin flip as to whether it's accurate or not. When you then consider people like Steve Diamond, who were compulsive or pathological liars, it's unlikely the results would have been accurate at all. Certainly not enough to be used as a foundation for life-altering decisions, and definitely not enough for Jeremy Kyle to stand on stage and abuse, belittle, and recommend things to these people. The excuse the showrunners gave when faced with this fact was that they did tell the guests themselves that the result could be wrong.
You failed it, pal. Where did you take the money?
I didn't take the money.
If you took the money, you got it written all over your face. It's written all over your face, pal.
Failed the test. Why did you fail the test? Because you're a liar, aren't you? No. It's easy to stand on television and say she did this and she did that. You're a tea leaf.
But as you can see, he didn't add this particularly important information to the main segment of the show. No, instead he used those results as if they were a stick to beat people with and to humiliate them with. On top of all this, the victims of the show were not just on screen, but behind it. One of the producers, the one responsible for the Steve Diamond episode that never aired, eventually was also gone from this world. The guilt of bringing him on, what happened to him, and the jobs of her long-term colleagues was just too much. Jeremy Kyle throughout the years remained silent on the matter, though he did do an interview when taking another job on television, which he of course still receives to this day, and during that interview he claimed he'd been diagnosed with anxiety disorder after losing the show. I mean, it was a lot to handle, losing that show, you see. It was on for 14 years, and it was a really big part of Jeremy Kyle's life. It must have been hard for him to no longer play God to the cheering masses as you pass judgment on those you believe are utter filth.
No, I don't understand. Trying to... Well, they're terrible one fucking guests. We've done it again. They're as thick as shit.
To not have any more props to use in your ascension to daytime television superstar. To feed your ego more, under the guise of helping people. Which is what he claimed this was. Which anybody can plainly see, this is not help.
You are one of the most disgusting people I've ever met in my entire life, and what I read about you would make any person with a brain cell recoil in horror.
Help isn't when somebody's an addict and you shout at them calling them a disgrace, blaming them for everything they've done with cheers from the cultists behind you. Telling people you're there to help them, telling people they'll be sent to rehab if they can't afford it, all they have to do is come on the show and open up, then mercilessly bullying them for cheap laughs. This was class warfare, plain and simple. Jeremy Kyle was a rich kid from a privileged background, a private school, university, and all that comes with it. He grew into a rich man who saw poor people with their typical poor people problems as absolute disgusting filth. He frequently said as much on his show. You cannot fake the look on his face or the snarl to his words when he spoke to these people that he claimed to be helping. He used his platform to exercise this power dynamic of saying whatever he could to people he deemed less than himself. And ironically, he did this for an audience who were probably not that much higher in his own estimation, but could at least trick themselves into feeling superior for an hour a day watching him do it to somebody else. Someone who they almost certainly had more in common with than they did Jeremy Kyle. The Jeremy Kyle Show was a vile, miserable, evil TV show that brought out the worst in the viewers and fed the ego of a man with a god complex. To this day, Jeremy Kyle still gets work on broadcast television.
Listen, I've been cancelled.
Yeah.
In this world, it seems now that unless you follow a certain path, you're labelled.